my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome to episode 52 of the podcast. And today I want to do a great quilting debate. Yes, we're getting back to debating the different topics of quilting that quilters like to argue about. And today I'm taking on Scant 1/4 inch seams. So this is a whole thing that makes me a little crazy when it comes to quilt piecing, and that is when you measure a scant quarter versus a 1/4 inch. And the whole thing is entirely confusing. I'm giving away my bias on this already. So I want to take on this debate and talk about it a lot during this episode. But first, I always like to share a little intro about what's going on around the house. And today I am in my kitchen and unloading a big pile of groceries and gonna get dinner going. So we're making some BLT salads today, or James wants a BLT. I just want a salad. And yeah, so I ran to the grocery store and that took a lot longer than I was expecting. And you know, the day kind of just got away from me. So I was just like, all right, well, I'll just turn on the camera and record this intro while Josh is getting James from karate and I'm getting this on. So yeah. So right now I'm pulling out bacon and spreading it out on a pan. And just so you know, in case this is the first podcast episode you've ever heard or seen, we do have a video so you can watch what I'm doing. In addition to just listening, it's totally up to you. And I'd love to know which version of the podcast that you like best. It's really nice to know how you prefer to get it. And I know there are a lot of people on YouTube that are watching, and then we have a whole totally different crowd of people that like to listen via iTunes or whatever player that you like to listen to. So send us an email, leahday.com/contact, or just leave a comment if you're on YouTube below the video and let us know how you like to listen or see or hear the podcast. That would be great. So updates for this week. Been a lot going on. Some of it, I can't show you everything this week because some of it's kind of secret sewing, which isn't my favorite. I like to be able to be working on something and be excited about it and sharing it with you like right that second. And so that's a little tough, but at the same time, you know, it's one of those things about being a professional quilter. You know, sometimes you gotta keep it quiet, so that way, whenever something comes out, in the end, it doesn't look stale. And this is something that I've noticed is kind of a problem for fabric designers. So fabric designers have been sharing, you know, kind of their images of their fabric prints and stuff early on Instagram, and so then by the time quilt market rolls around, everything kind of looks old, like, oh, I've already seen that. Well, yeah, you have already seen that. You got a sneak peek of it, you know, through Instagram or whatever. So I've been kind of keeping that in mind and trying to be patient with it. But yeah, just doing a lot of quilting. Yesterday, I put myself in jail and just gave myself the opportunity to quilt and not get on a computer, not touch a computer at all. And that was quite a relief. I really enjoyed that. So I had to wash up my bacony hands there and then start the oven. I bake my bacon. It was something my dad taught me how to do. Used to, I would always fry it, and it would take forever to fry up a whole pan of bacon. And then I started using, you know, big, basically kind of a serrated sheet pan, like a roasting pan, and spread it out. And then 375 degrees, 10 minutes, and then you flip it, and then another 10 minutes. Works great. And I am using a sugar-free bacon that I managed to find, kind of surprising, in Shelby, North Carolina. It's Jones brand, all natural, no sugar, uncured bacon. It's really, really, really good. And I like a bacon that will give me a lot of bacon grease. Sorry, I am from the South. And yes, I fry things in bacon grease, and it is delicious. And I'm not gonna apologize for it. So while that's gonna bake, then I'm going to start dicing up my veggies. So if you hear me banging around, then that's what I'm doing. Yeah, so the other thing I've been working on, big post going up this week on Prism Path. That is our quilt along that we started last week. We got our fabric prepped up and everything ready to go. And then this week I shared the second post on that quilt, which is how to piece your strip sets, and answered a lot of questions there. You know, when I wrote that pattern, I was really worried that, you know, when the piecing you might make a mistake or something like that. So I had you piece extra strip sets. So I covered that in the post and just explain that you were going to have leftover pieces, you know, at the end, and you could piece those into the back. That would be kind of cool. And yeah, so I'm already starting to see a few Prism Path quilts finished. There's always people that like to jump ahead of a quilt along, and there's nothing I can do about it, obviously. It's just, you know, one of those things, you know, and I totally understand it. You know, when time and energy allows, you know, you like that feeling of getting ahead versus the feeling of falling behind. You know, the feeling of falling behind is not a good one. So I'm always trying to figure out ways of keeping people at the same pace as I am. It's a little bit of a struggle, but it's something that I'm always trying to figure out. Like in years past, I've made my quilt-alongs mysteries, so you don't get to see it at all until that block comes up. And that kind of has worked. But then there's a whole host of people that are like, I'm not doing a mystery. You know, they don't trust me to come up with a good quilt pattern, which I don't blame them. You know, that's okay. It's one of those things. Sometimes you can, you know, you want to know what the quilt's going to look like before you commit to a 12-month project that you might in the end not end up liking. So it's completely understandable. So yeah, so Prism Path was in the book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day, and it's the third quilt that we're making together from the book. So yeah, all you need is a copy of the book, and then if you want to pick up the rainbow batik fat quarters, we have those, and then we also have the thread colors that I used in my quilt too. And I did two different versions. The version in the book is kind of an off-white background, and it gives you one look. And then because I'd already pieced it that way once, I knew I really wanted to try something a little different the second go round, so I pieced it with black for this new version, and I really like it because it just really shows the quilting. You can really see what everything looks like. So yeah, find this new post that I just put up at leahday.com/prism2, and that's where you can find it, link up, and learn about, it's a Bargello piecing technique. And Bargello quilting is really interesting. It actually originated as a needlepoint technique. It was a needlepoint design, and I did a little bit of research because I already vaguely in the back of my head knew where it came from, but I just wanted to double check myself. So I looked on Wikipedia, and the name Bargello comes from the Bargello Palace in Florence, Italy, and that's where they found these chairs that were covered in this pretty needlepoint that had this very distinctive style. And so that's where the name comes from. And then quilters along the way realized, wait a minute, we can piece those, you know, with little pieces. You know, we can piece those with strip sets and then cut them up. And something I wrote in the post is, this is taking the criticism of quilting up a notch. You know, the criticism, if somebody doesn't really understand or get quilting, they usually will say, well, why are you cutting up fabric into little pieces just to piece it all back together again? That's the criticism. And then, you know, Bargello quilting takes it up another notch because we piece things together and then we cut them up, and then we piece them together, or no, wait, we cut up fabric, piece it together, then we cut that up and piece it together again. So yeah, it takes it up a whole nother notch. And I love it. It creates a very, very distinctive style of quilt, and it's a lot easier than trying to piece, you know, cut out every single little square and piece them all together one by one. So another thing that we're continuing to post every single Friday is a new walking foot quilting design. So last Friday, I taught you how to quilt square spiral, which is a really cool design. And the best thing about it is it's very fast. So you get started quilting from the center, and it's gonna feel a little slow because you're making very small, short little lines for your spiral. But then very quickly it grows and builds. And if you're quilting from the center of your quilt, you know, it's going to feel easier and easier to stitch with every line you do, basically. So yeah, go and check out that post. That's at leahday.com/square spiral. So every Friday, I'm posting a new walking foot quilting design from the book, and I'd say we're about halfway done at this point. So I'm thinking I'll probably double up on my walking foot videos, the Marvelous Mosaic, the new design videos that I've been sharing, probably double up on those after we finish Prism Path. and start sharing one on Monday and then one on Friday, because I'm kind of in the mood to get back to free motion quilting and then new videos on my long arm. So I've been getting a lot more experience on the long arm. I finally feel comfortable sharing some videos on it, just some tips and ideas. And I've also taught a few classes, just, you know, having a few people over to my house to hang out and learn a little bit more about it. And I've learned from them, which has been really, really helpful. And, you know, and just gaining more confidence and sharing the machine and explaining how to use it. So I hope that you're looking forward to that too. And if you have suggestions for quilting tutorials that you would like to see, you know, maybe something that you'd like to learn from me specifically, or just something that you cannot find a tutorial on online, please let me know. I'd really like to film the videos and share the tutorials that you really want to see. And that would be great. So either leave us a comment below the video or send us an email at leahday.com/contact. And just as a little reminder, if you're looking for more podcast episodes to enjoy, you can find them all linked up together at leahday.com/podcast. So come and check that out. And now here's the show, all about the great quilting debate, scant versus 1/4" seams. Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome to this great quilting debate about 1/4" versus scant seams. So this is something a little nitpicky in the quilting world. This is definitely something you will start hearing as you get more into piecing. If you have never heard of scant 1/4" seams before, that might be why. You might never have run across it in a quilt pattern or in a book. But trust me, it's out there and it makes me a little crazy. So first off, what is a scant 1/4" seams? Well, this was the way I had it described to me when I first started quilting, and that was 1 thread less than a 1/4" seam allowance. Now, how do you measure that? You know, how do you even begin to measure that or even wrap your brain around what that is? That is not a measurement on a ruler, and that's going to change depending on the width of the thread that you're talking about. So obviously a 50 weight cotton thread is going to be a very different thickness from a, let's say, 12 weight wool thread. So that's part of the reason why I feel like this is so subjective and also very confusing. We're basically saying take the 1/4" foot that you have on your machine, and I've got mine right here. So take the 1/4" foot on your machine, which is going to give you a 1/4" seam allowance, but don't pay attention to that. Scoot it inside by 1 thread width. So instead of lining up your fabrics on the edge of the foot, scoot it inside by 1 thread width in. And by the way, you know, the foot is solid. Mine is solid metal. You can't see through it. So how would you even know that you're scooching your fabric in the right amount? But basically line it up into the inside of the foot and stitch it consistently 1 thread width less than the seam allowance you're going to get on the foot. So for obvious reasons, I have a little bit of an issue with scant 1/4" seams because it's confusing. How do you measure it? How do you line it up on your foot? I know some quilters will move their needle. They'll use a 1/4" foot, but then they'll move their needle in order to achieve a scant 1/4. Personally, I just find that all very, very confusing. And, you know, it starts to run into an issue. Like, what if you forget and you stitch half your quilt with scant 1/4 and then you stitch the other half of the quilt with regular 1/4"? You're gonna, that little thread width of amount of space is going to start adding up, and it's going to lead to inconsistencies the further and further you go through your quilt. So for that reason, I don't teach it, I don't like it, and whenever I hear the word scant, I think scant. It actually glitches out my brain like that. I always think of it in that like robot voice, scant. I don't know, it just makes me laugh because I just find it a little silly. You know, it's one of those obsessive compulsive things about piecers in particular can get really nitpicky about. So what is my advice when it comes to seam allowance? Well, personally, I don't care. If you like to use a scant quarter, use a scant quarter. If you'd like to use a regular 1/4 inch patchwork foot and piece to that patchwork foot, go with that. The key that I think is most important, that is absolutely essential, is to be consistent. So whatever you're using in your quilt, however you're lining up the seams, even if you're using 1/2 inch seam allowances for a quilt, which is gigantic, but hey, if that's your thing, go with it, you know, but keep it consistent through the entire thing. And this is the challenge for a lot of quilters. This is the real hard part about it, is that as we're quilting, you know, sometimes we're, you know, chain piecing, you know, and chain things through our machine. And maybe we lose a little bit of focus and things, you know, the seam allowance starts going just a little bit wide. And then we move on to piecing things together. Like, let's say we're putting the units together of a quilt block. And then we start getting a lot more particular and take our time, and maybe we've turned off the show on Netflix that we've been watching and we're paying a little bit more attention. And then now we're piecing with a dead set accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then, you know, maybe we pulled out a glass of wine, you know, and it's the evening, and then, you know, that seam allowance starts to shrink and get smaller. Well, all of those different inconsistencies can lead to points not lining up, you know, points basically not being pointy, and seams not lining up in our piecing. So the key is, no matter what's going on, no matter what you're doing, no matter if you're chain piecing or strip piecing or just stitching 2 squares together, it doesn't matter. Always piece with the same stitch length. And the hardest part about this is having the same stitch length through a long seam. That's really, I think, one of the hardest things to master, because it gets boring. And I'm the first person to tell you, piecing can be very boring, mindless work. And I think the biggest trick that I find is start with a scrap charger. This is just a 2.5 inch square folded in half. And that produces, you know, 2 layers of fabric. You stitch through that first. And that allows you to get the foot up to the right height for piecing, so that you can slip the next pieces underneath the foot and then butt them up right against the needle. And so when you have it in that situation, so that the needle, the very next stitch you're going to take is onto your fabrics, well, then they're kind of in jail and they can't slip. You can also double and triple check that your seam allowance is correct, that the edges of those pieces are lined up just exactly perfectly with the edge of your presser foot. Now, what if you don't have a 1/4 inch patchwork foot? First off, I think it's a great investment. So if you don't have one, look around in your area, try and find a 1/4 inch patchwork foot that is compatible with your machine. It is one of those essential tools that I think all quilters should have. But if you don't have one thing you could do, you could use a regular straight stitch or zigzag stitch foot, and then move your needle over and measure to see where that 1/4 inch is. So what you'll basically do is take a lot of squares and line them up with the edge of the foot, move the needle over to where it kind of looks like it's a 1/4 inch, stitch it, measure it, see where you're at. And yes, you need to measure that with a quilting ruler so that you can see through it and make sure it's accurate down the full length of the seam. So that can really help, and that definitely works. That's how I began piecing. I did not have a 1/4 inch patchwork foot. I used a regular zigzag foot on my machine and dialed the needle over I just scooched it over by 1 setting, and that was enough to give me a fairly accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. And that worked for a few years until I finally was like, all right, Leah, you're serious about this quilting thing? Go get a freaking patchwork foot. You know what I mean? It's one of those little investments. It shouldn't be all that expensive, but it can definitely make a really big difference in how it feels, how easy it feels to piece. Because you never know, you might sit down at your machine and you know that you need to move your needle over 2 movements or 1 movement or whatever you need to do to set it up, and you forget. And then all of a sudden everything's off when you either have to rip it all out or just accept the fact that that quilt is just nothing's gonna line up on it now. And that's okay too. So really, I think consistency is the key. And what I was saying is the full length of the seam. So start with a scrap charger, stitch through that, then line up your pieces so they're lined up with the edge of your patchwork foot. And your needle is going to take the very next stitch onto those pieces, so you know you're starting on the right foot. You know that you're starting dead set accurate, 100% perfect seam allowance. So then you start stitching your seam, and basically about every 3 to 4 inches, stop with your needle in the down position and check in on it. You know, make sure that the fabric is not slipping out even slightly, even by 1 thread width out from the side of your piecing foot. Whenever Dad was helping me piece the Rainbow Log Cabin quilt, he started having issues with the blocks not coming out the right size, and there were multiple seams through that block that would result, you know, it's a compounding situation, so that with every seam taken too big, slightly too big, that adds up till by the end it can be 1/8 of an inch off or 1/4 inch off. It's always a building process. So watch out for that. You should see no fabric, not even a single thread extending beyond the edge of the foot. And then also be watching for sliding to the inside. I mean, it's metal, it's hard to see. Use a bright light, you know, and get a little bright light, you know, something that you can point right at the edge of the foot so that you can see if it's slipping to the inside. You can also see if it's slipping to the outside. You want that to stay just perfectly lined up with the edge of the patchwork foot. And then the hard part is maintaining focus through the full long length of the seam. You know, we're piecing really long strips. It's not my favorite thing in the world to do, to piece full width of fabric strips, which is 40 to 44 inches long. It's not my favorite thing in the world because it's just dull, it's kind of boring, and it's hard to maintain focus through the full thing. So, you know, it is definitely a stop-start process. I don't just, you know, press on my foot pedal and pedal the metal on it. I stop every 3 to 4 inches, check in on it, make sure that things are lined up properly, keep going, stitch another 3 or 4 inches, check in on it again. So it can take some time, although I would say strip piecing is a whole lot faster. You know, the technique of strip piecing is piecing long strips together and then cutting them so that you have strip units. That's a lot faster than having to cut out every single little square of your quilt and piece them together, you know, at the end. So, you know, there's all of these techniques that we can use, and you just kind of have to figure out what is your favorite, what do you like to use. And I'm sharing with you, obviously, some of my biases and my opinions here. And while I love the ease and simplicity and speed of strip piecing, it's not always my favorite in the actual process of piecing those strips together. That's not my favorite part of it. Okay, so what are some other things that we can do to ensure our seam allowance comes out at exactly 1/4 inch? And this is going beyond the whole scant quarter debate, you know, just trying to make sure that we are adding the 1/4 inch in whenever we cut our pieces. So if you want a 2-inch square finished, then you need to cut a dead set accurate 2.5 inch square. You need to cut that out first. So starting with the right size, shape, cut. And this is another rant for another day, but I do think it's important to pick one brand of rulers and stick with that and cut your entire quilt with one brand of rulers, because every ruler brand has a different way of marking the lines. Every ruler brand has a different way of dealing with that extra 1/2 inch on the ruler, all that kind of good stuff. So it's really important to pick one brand of rulers and use them consistently through the entire quilt. And that's going to make your cutting more accurate, which is going to make your piecing more accurate. Okay, so when it comes to piecing accurately, I really think a good habit to get into is to measure your seams. And this sounds a little fiddly and definitely a little time consuming, you know, that's a lot of attention and detail and focus. But basically when I was first getting started, I kept a ruler, and I still do. I keep this ruler near my sewing machine. And after stitching the seam, I would press the seam allowance open because I find that makes my blocks a lot more accurate and also flattens out that seam so it's easier to quilt over. And I have done another great quilting debate on pressing seams open, so please go check that out and listen to that great quilting debate too. So I keep this ruler next to my machine so I can place this on top of that seam after the seam allowances have been pressed open and measure it. I can also measure the finished size of my piece. So let's say I take two 2.5-inch squares and sew them together. Well, I've eaten up 1/4 inch from either square, so that piece should now measure 4.5 inches square. Quilting math is kind of crazy. You're adding and subtracting at the same time, but basically you should be able to measure that rectangle that you've created, and it should measure 2.5 by 4.5. And if it doesn't, let's say it comes in a little too small, that means that you took away too much. You took away more than 1/4 inch with that seam. If it comes in too big, then bigger than 4.5 inches long, then that means that you did not take enough away and your seam allowance is running just a little bit too small. So you can start measuring your seams and checking yourself with every single seam. And yes, this is a little fiddly. This is a little focused and attention to detail kind of thing, but that's going to really give you that very close focus on your piecing to know exactly where you're going wrong. What is it? Is it when you piece a half square triangle? Is it when you piece a flying geese? Is it only off whenever you piece long strips together? Where is it that you struggle with making sure that you have that dead set accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance? Or is it always consistently off? This was the case with my dad. Every single block that he made for that log cabin quilt was consistently off the same amount. And I measured it and I was like, well, Dad, of all the problems that you can have, this is actually not that bad, because the fact that you're consistently off means I can still piece all of these blocks together and it's still gonna work. So if you find that your seams are consistently just a little bit too big, well, what that means is that your blocks are always going to be consistently a little smaller than they're supposed to be. But so long as you maintain that throughout, quilts are a building process, everything should still work out okay. Now, when you get into extreme precision miniature piecing, let's say you want to piece a block and you want it to finish at 3 inches square or smaller, really, really tiny miniature quilts, that's when you can really dial in and focus on this the most. And the quilter that I learned from, it was actually the very first quilting workshop that I ever took, was with Sally Collins. And I love that that was the first workshop I ever took, because it taught me from day one the importance of seam allowance and the importance of precision and the importance of measuring those seams. So I can definitely recommend Sally Collins. She has a wide variety of books, I think, still available, and she does miniature quilts, or quilts, I should say. They're not necessarily miniature quilts because some of them can get very big, but they all have very itsy bitsy tiny little pieces in them that make up the quilt. And she doesn't do, it's not a cheat. It's not paper piecing or something like that that allows her to get that small. It is traditionally pieced, but just with very careful precision, measuring those seams, making sure she's accurate, and stitching with a short stitch length. This is one of those things that a lot of people think that I piece with a short stitch length because I like to press my seams open. Well, that's part of the reason why, but another part of the reason why is when you piece with a short stitch length, the pieces are more locked together, they're tighter, the thread takes up actually less space in that seam. Yes, the thread that you were using as you piece pieces together can be affecting your seam allowance. This is getting super nitpicky. So, the thickness of that thread, I only ever piece with 50 weight cotton, so that way it's very, very thin and it's not taking up very much space at all in that seam, so I'm not losing space to my thread. And then also dialing down that stitch length to 1.5 millimeters is also going to result in tight, tiny stitches, holding those pieces together, locking them together super, super tight, and ensuring that that is taking up the least amount of space in that seam allowance possible. Great test for this. Stitch a 4-patch with 2.5-inch squares and change threads. So do one in like a really, really super thin thread, and then do another one in, let's say, like a 30 weight or 40 weight regular thread that you would normally use for piecing, okay? And just compare. and see what happens, because I think that you will be surprised by just the difference that can be, the amount of space that can be taken up by the thread you're using to piece your pieces together. You know, it is surprising. All of these little things are coming together, and it takes time to start to acknowledge all of those little things that come together to create an accurately, perfectly pieced quilt. So now this circles back to the whole scant 1/4 inch thing. As you can tell, I prefer to piece and describe piecing with an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. And but I also go into obviously a lot of detail on measuring seams, making sure that you are taking away exactly the amount that you need so that the finished piece, you know, it really doesn't even matter what's going on the back of the quilt so long as the finished piece is coming out the right size, you know? And so there are reasons why I think scant became popular and why it took off, you know, and became a thing. Because, you know, if you have everyone piecing with a different width of thread and it's taking up a lot of space in these seams, and then if you have, you know, big chunky stitches going on, and then all the seams are being pressed to one side, I mean, that's a lot of different things combining to eat up more space in the seam allowance. And so if things weren't turning out the right size, then it would make sense, okay, well, let's all piece with smaller stitch length so that way we can get away with all these other things and still have blocks that come out the right size. So if that's your thing and you've been doing it for years and it works for you, rock it, go with it, you know, stick with your scant 1/4 inch seams. I find that personally really confusing. I would rather say, let's piece with a thinner thread. Let's use a 1/4 inch patchwork foot. Let's lower our stitch length and press the seams open so that we can piece with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We don't have to worry about it being tinier or smaller or whatever that is. You know, I don't have to worry about describing that to someone who has never pieced anything ever before. You know, because I really think scant in its fundamental nature is more of an advanced thing to even hear about. And to a beginner, it is very confusing. So for that reason, I don't teach it and I don't use it. And my pieces still come out the right size. And I think ultimately that's the point. It doesn't matter how we get there, as long as we're piecing blocks that we're happy with, that we're enjoying the process, and that they're coming out the way we want them to come out. If you don't mind when your seams don't match or your points aren't pointy, then clearly this is not something that you need to worry about at all. But if that drives you nuts and you really want to know how to improve it, and you really want to know how to make every single seam match and every single point to come out pointy, then this is something that I think you should take on. Grab a ruler. It can be the quilting ruler that you use to cut out the pieces of your quilt. Keep that next to your sewing machine. And with every seam you stitch, measure your piece. You know, you can do the math on your piece where it's basically like, okay, I'm piecing something together. These are 2.5 inch squares. What you need to do is kind of just do the quilting math where you're putting those two together, so 2.5 plus 2.5, and then subtract the 1/4 inch from both sides. So then subtract a 1/2 inch. So instead of 5, it will measure 4.5. So it's simple quilting math. You kind of have to add and subtract, but it really will pay off and make a big difference. If you measure every seam, if you measure your finished piece, every time you add on a new piece to it, you'll really start to gain some insight into your piecing. You'll start to gain some insight into your habits behind the sewing machine and begin to improve. You know, it's one of those things where sometimes we can be quilting one way for years and years and years, and it's that one special quilt that we really, really want it to turn out just exactly right. And then, you know, maybe something happens and it doesn't turn out, it's just exactly the way you wanted it to. And that's what spurs growth and innovation and learning something new. Like, why didn't that come out right? You know, why didn't those points match up, or why didn't those seams line up easily? And that can drive you into learning more about the building nature of patchwork and quilting and all of the stuff that comes in kind of behind the scenes that connects everything together and ends up creating that beautiful pattern of your quilt. So I hope that you have enjoyed this great quilting debate and that you can understand, a little bit more about scant quarter and where that all comes from and why some quilters use it. And then you can also understand where I'm coming from, why I describe a regular 1/4 inch seam allowance, but I'm really picky about how that 1/4 inch seam is stitched with a patchwork foot, with thin thread, with a short stitch length. And then also this kind of reinforces my other whole tangents that I go into, which is fabric preparation, starching, pressing, and pressing my seam allowances open, and then still, stitching right in the ditch. All of these different little things can be debated, and I have debated a lot of them because they are the things that quilters do like to argue about. And it's interesting that we argue about them, and I think that's part of what makes quilting so awesome, is there isn't one single way of doing it. There is no right and wrong. There's only the method that works best for you. So find it. And once you find it, stick with it. You don't have to question it anymore. Once you figure out what works for you, go with it, rock it, make a million quilts, and have a blast doing something that makes you happy and makes the world more beautiful. So I hope that you enjoyed this great quilting debate and you learned something new. If you would like to hear me debate something about quilting that drives you crazy, please send me an email at leahday.com/contact, and I may just take on that debate for you as well. You can find all of the podcast episodes that we've shared so far at leahday.com/podcast. And while you're on my website, come and check out my quilt shop. It helps support the show and allows me to continue sharing new podcast episodes every single week. Until next time, let's go quilt. I think scant, scant, scant. It actually glitches out my brain like that. I always think of it in that like robot voice. Scant, 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 scant.